Okay, so continuing on through the module here, I want to introduce and talk about the idea of provincialism a little bit. So provincialism is the tendency of different geographic regions to house unique species, genera, or family. So it's sort of a way to quantify or show the uniqueness of a certain area, the biodiversity of that area, so that you can make comparisons to other areas and look at some more broad scale patterns. There's a few sort of patterns that are associated specifically with this concept of provincialism. One is that the most closely related species tend to have overlapping or adjacent regions within the restricted areas where they're found. Also, completely unrelated higher taxa, which, when we say higher taxa, we're usually talking about orders or classes, something above like the species level. They often show similar patterns of endemism. And so remember, we just talked about endemism. And a small number of related taxa have very disjunct ranges. So here, if we were to sort of look at what we're talking about here, this is a division of the world into 35 biogeographic regions based on the distribution of land plants. So obviously you can make these sort of categories or geographic boundaries based off of different types of organisms. Here we're using land plants. And one thing that's worth probably noting here is that if you were to use some different group, if you were to use terrestrial mammals, for instance, you would have different biogeographic provinces. Maybe some of them would be similar, but some of them would be different as well. And you could use aquatic species or whatever it was, but you're sort of going to get some different delineations here, and some of them might be similar in some cases because some communities are really tightly linked together while others are not. Here we're seeing the classic biogeographic provinces of Australia, and that's in A. So you can see these four classic biogeographic provinces. And here we can, in B, we're seeing the map of the climatic slash productivity pattern. So it's sort of a combination of like precipitation patterns and also primary productivity that's being mapped out here, and you can sort of see how closely it resembles the biogeographic provinces if we did things that way. So you're sort of getting this broad central region where it's arid, not a lot of precipitation, not a lot of vegetation, and so and that corresponds to what we're seeing here. But basically, a lot of the productivity is clustered to these more coastal areas that aren't in the interior of the continent. So here we're looking at the biogeographic provinces of South America, and here we can see that they correspond largely to the geologic and climatic features that are in South America, specifically the Andes Mountains, which is probably the most prominent geologic feature of South America. And so you have the Andes Mountains running along the western coast here. And so you can see a lot of differentiation, lots of like fine scale changes in the biogeographic provinces that exist in there. And then sort of the other things that correspond to this, I mean, you have like some rainforest, there's the Brazilian rainforest, and there's all sorts of things that probably correspond to precipitation patterns, also in correspondence to the mountain range, which is going to be influencing those precipitation patterns as well. And there's some desert and stuff in here as well. So in general, this is a pattern we see over and over again, that provinces tend to be closely linked to the geologic and climatic features of the area. Similarly, if we're looking here in North America at our biogeographic provinces, we can again see that they conform really closely as well to the geologic and climatic features. So if you're looking at the eastern United States, there's like two, the eastern, I guess, yeah, it's the United States and into Canada here. There's basically only two biogeographic provinces, and maybe three if you want to draw a line all the way through North America. If you compare that to the western part of North America, there's a lot more types of provinces. And what do we know about the western portion of North America? Well, there's a lot more mountains. There's the Rocky Mountains, there's the Sierra Nevada Mountains, and the other smaller mountain ranges that occur in through here and in the Pacific Northwest and coastal areas in the Rockies. And you'll notice the other major mountain range in the United States is probably the Smoky Mountains, which is, along through this area. So the geologic and geographic how geologic patterns change geographically is going to have a strong influence on the types of organisms that can accumulate there and will exist there. And ultimately, that's going to be reflected in these types of aggregations of however you want to aggregate these. But in this case, biogeographic provinces, I think this is based off of mammals, land mammals. No matter what you're looking at, it's probably going to be in some way linked to the climatic and geologic features of the area. North America's deserts have actually, they've been, for a long time, they were divided into 4 provinces, which you see here. However, a 5th province more recently that's along the Baja California Peninsula, which is down here, was recognized after a recent study that was molecular based on DNA of the organisms that exist there, revealed a really high number of endemic lineages. So basically, this area has a lot of species that are endemic or evolved from endemic lineages to the extent that they think it now represents its own province within the desert sort of biome in this area. If we wanted to look at something a little bit different, we could look at the biogeographic provinces of North American freshwater fish. And again, we can see that they correspond to a major geologic feature, in this case, the major drainage basins, specifically around the Great Lakes and sort of like Hudson Bay and stuff up here. But you can see some differentiation around the Great Lakes region, but there's some other stuff going on here as well. So the main takeaway there is that when you start aggregating at larger spatial scales, you're going to see the strong influence of the geologic and climatic features of an area. Okay, so I want to sort of transition here and look at some attempts to quantify the similarities among biotas. So let's look at, this comes from a 1968 analysis, a little bit of an older paper. It's actually one of the earliest attempts to use quantitative methods to look at similarities of different groups of organisms and try to categorize sort of different provinces, or at least different aggregates. And so they were found similar biogeographic regions for birds and butterflies within the Indo-Australian area, but different for bats. So basically they were looking at all of the organisms that had the ability to fly, and well, not all, I guess butterflies were only a portion of the insects, but looking at those types of organisms and seeing if they exhibited similar patterns. And they found that butterflies and birds do. If you look at the delineations here, very similar types of delineations in terms of, there was a group here and this specific group and the group over here were fundamentally different. However, you saw different sort of groupings within the bats group. So some interesting patterns there. A 2005 study used a clustering analysis. Not super important what that means. Well, we won't get into it, but basically they're clustering the phylogenetic similarities found in related. They found patterns related to dispersal and vicariance in insects and vascular plants, but they found different clustering that was based on temperature for seabirds. So basically, here's the phylogenetic structure for the insect groups and the vascular plant groups, and they're looking in this area here, which is basically like the islands around Antarctica and Antarctica itself. and they found that basically it was the islands, like they clustered around the formation of the islands. Might be hard to read that a little bit, but those are basically the names of the little islands and stuff in here. And they found that sort of clustering. So that was, they thought that was probably related to dispersal events and maybe vicarious events if organisms have been there for a long time, and basically barriers had formed between theirs. But seabirds had a different thing. So here they're clustering based off of temperatures of the locations where they're found. So it's a little bit interesting, a little bit different relationship. And it comes down to how do these organisms fit ecologically within the area that they're found. So seabirds are dependent on things that are related, or at least tend to be more dependent on things that are related to temperature. And maybe they themselves are more highly influenced by temperature. So interesting things going on there. Okay, so I'm going to finish up this video. There's a reading here about the North American desert butterfly biodiversity, so the biodiversity of this group. So keep working your way through the module, and I'll see you in the next video.